Objectivism and relativism. This week we'll consider a few positions that are referred to as meta-ethical positions. What that means is these are positions that scope over the whole of ethics and morality discussions. These are positions that often underlie and they're very fundamental to the way people like many of the authors that we'll be reading this semester, as well as just everyday people. A lot of folks assume these positions, they take them up, they're underlying their reasoning, and it's extremely helpful if one knows about them and is aware of them while they're reading or encountering moral and ethical value conflicts and various debates about ethical issues and questions. That if you're familiar with these positions, you can see them. You'll just see them under the reasoning. And all the strengths that might be associated with these positions, well, those are added to whatever argumentation you're looking at. If it's based on a strong position, just a real fundamental position, then that can strengthen the argument about a particular case, like, say, abortion or euthanasia. If it's based on a strong position, then it becomes even stronger in regards to that specific case. But also, if an argument is based on or is assuming a weaker meta-ethical position, like underneath all the words, everything that's said, if that position is weaker, the assumptions of it, then all of those weaknesses, they percolate up into their argument about a specific case or question or issue or concern. So if you're aware of these positions, then we already have an advantage when we begin looking at specific cases, because we'll know if you can see that a position's at play, then you'll know where it's strong, where it's weak, before you ever even pay attention to the actual words that have been written by the author. That'll become clearer as we do it throughout the semester. But that's why these positions are referred to as meta-ethical. They scope over all ethical debates and discussions. So just to review, during the first week, we talked about like value conflicts and norms and how values are often assumed, or how they are what tends to come into conflict when there's a disagreement about some ethical or moral matter. And then last week, we worked through argumentation. We worked through an example of it during the discussion, and we saw how we can apply that philosophical pattern of inquiry to passages in order to pull out like the questions that are in play, the big major claim that an author might be making, the various reasons that author is offering, and also how to charitably restate their position or their argument, and then how to start an analysis of that argument. We saw all of that last week and got to practice some of it, pieces of that pattern of inquiry during last week's discussion. So this week we'll consider these positions, a few of these medical ethical positions. We'll consider the positions, then we'll consider some of the pros and cons, the strengths and the typically pointed to weaknesses of them. Then there'll be some comments about how this relates to our weekly discussion this week, as well as a few comments about the textbook readings associated with this week. To begin, we're taking the time to learn about these positions, as I said, because they're implied by or underneath many of the arguments we'll be encountering. And if you know about them now, you're much better prepared to be able to find weaknesses or strengths in various passages of text and in various articles. We'll see that by the end of this video, how knowing about these positions can be very helpful. Each of them can be understood in many ways. Sometimes they're presented differently than this, but this is the way that I've always kind of made the most sense of them and understood them. They can be understood as offering answers to these types of questions. The first question is like, when it comes to ethics and morality, who or what do we ultimately answer to? That this question comes up more than one would think, that in the sort of articles that we'll be reading and encountering throughout the semester, a lot of times an answer to this is already assumed. Namely, it's one of these positions and that's it. It never goes any deeper than that. But in the real world, not in cherry-picked articles by philosophy people or ethicists written by philosophy and ethical people for philosophy and ethical people, which is the articles we're encountering a lot this semester, especially in our textbook, that out in the real world, though, people take this question extremely seriously. Like, it matters who a person thinks, who or what they think they ultimately answer to when it comes to rights and wrongs, goods and bads. Who or what has the ability to actually say that, yep, you did something wrong, and actually has the authority to do that, to morally condemn you, or to morally praise you, to say, yeah, that was really good, and, you actually did a good thing there. I mean, we tend to care about that. It's not uncommon for people somebody will make a claim about, oh, yeah, this group, we're not really worried about them. And then someone says, well, what gives you the right to judge or make that judgment? We're familiar with that thing. Everybody in here, if you think about it and kind of look through these questions, you'll begin to see that, yeah, that people care about this. But so the 4 questions, they tend to be, when it comes to ethics and morality, who or what do we ultimately answer to? And these other 3 are just variations on that original question there in bold. It's like, who has the final say about the morality or immorality or the ethical or unethical aspects of our decisions and actions? Once again, keep in mind, morality, immorality, you could just as easily substitute ethical and unethical for our purposes. We're not making a distinction between those. When I say ethical, I could just as easily say moral. Or if I say immoral, you could just as easily say unethical. So who has the final say? Who's got the ability to have the final word? Like, maybe we think we didn't do something wrong, but we know that others may not think the same, and they may actually have the authority to correct our mistake. That's the way to think about it. And then it's like, what determines our values, disvalues, goods, bads, rights and wrongs, our moral truths, if there are such things? Who or what's in charge of those? Like, if it is in fact always wrong to kill an innocent being, something that's never done anything bad, it's totally innocent, it has no malicious intent, and then someone comes along and kills it. If you think that's wrong to do, then this is the sort of question, like, who ultimately determines that that's wrong? Who or what has the say? Who or what decides that something is actually of value for people versus a disvalue? Like, many times we've seen values. We're working with them throughout this entire semester, and we're becoming more and more familiar with them. That the thing is we'll often think, like, say, kindness is a value, whereas maliciousness or viciousness or meanness, those things tend to be labeled as disvalues. They don't have to be. Context matters. But typically we're familiar with this. We're like being deceptive or stealing. Those things are typically not put forward as being very worthwhile. Typically they're put forward as being something we want to avoid. They have disvalue. Well, who determines that? Who comes up with that stuff? Why, and moreover, what gives them the right or the authority to make that up? And then that leads into this question, like, who judges us as individuals, as groups? Who or what can decide, like, can sit in judgment over us? And like, who has the right to enforce its dictates upon us? Well, the dictates are these values, disvalues, what is supposed to be valuable, what is supposed to not be valuable, what one should do versus what one should avoid, what actions or decisions or behaviors or values count as good, and which of them count as bads, or when we say, someone did wrong, well, who ultimately decided that that was actually wrong? We certainly say it. We certainly think it at times. But the question is, how did it ever become wrong? Where did that come from? Where's the origin? And moreover, who has the right to enforce that upon us? Because that's the way ethics and morality tends to work. Remember, it's about typically like values come into conflict, or there is values in play. Some people consider something valuable or worthwhile. Others may consider it not as worthwhile as something else. Typically, there's a harm or a hurt or an injury potential at stake. And the idea is that just sets the stage. I mean, it sets the stage for blame to be placed on someone, or for someone to be shamed for getting that wrong, for navigating those values, disvalues, goods or bads in some kind of wrong way. And it also sets the stage for being praised for doing good things. Well, then the idea is, well, those are like dictates. Those are things that have been established, that have been handed down to us. Like, typically they're thought of as being handed to us or placed upon us. And the question is, well, who did that? What right did they have to pick the values or disvalues that we tend to hold? Well, the answers to these questions, we're already familiar with some of them. And I've said those questions in a lot of ways and said a lot of words about them, so you get a sense that, yeah, there's something at stake there. That people will tend to care about the answers to these kind of questions. And then the idea is, well, they can answer them. There's a lot of ways that they could be answered, but primarily there tends to be like 4 major ways they can be answered. All 4 of these questions, there tends to be 4 major ways, as well as a sort of conglomerate or a hybrid or a mishmash. Mishmash just means bundled all together, twisted all knotted up, ultimately a mess. That's what, there is a way to answer these questions that can be extremely rough to navigate. But then there's other more straightforward ways. Like when someone asks you, just think about it as an individual, when someone says, who or what do you ultimately answer to when it comes to rights and wrongs, goods and bads? Who ultimately passes judgment and decides whether you did something right or wrong, morally right or wrong? And well, one of the first answers we're all familiar with is we probably encountered this. Most people in here will have encountered it or heard about it at least, or been this way at some point in time, is that when someone says, who do you ultimately answer to? Like, say that someone comes in and you don't really like the person, they're a coworker, and so you decide, oh, well, I'll make their day a little worse than it would otherwise be. Why? Well, because I don't like them very much. And then the idea is, well, that's not very kind. And being unkind tends to be considered a disvalue. We know this. In some cultures and some places it is. And so the idea is like, well, we'll say you're unkind to that person. And say that you actually think that, yeah, that was probably not very good. That was probably bad to do. Well, where's that coming from? Like, who's deciding that you did good or you did bad by being unkind to someone else? Well, one answer a person could say is me, and only me. That I decide what's good and bad. I decide what's right and wrong. Only I do. No one else has any say about my behavior. No one has the right to enforce their values on me or their version of goods and bads. I make that up for myself and myself alone. It's just me. Me. I am the center of all that is valuable or disvaluable, or that's good or bad in my life. I'm the ultimate judge, the ultimate arbiter of that. That's one way a person can answer these questions. It's just one among many ways. And keep in mind, I'm not endorsing any of these positions. What we will do in this video is we're entertaining them rather than endorsing. It's an extremely important distinction that has a lot of influence in stuff that we'll read and encounter or that we do in everyday life, is that people can be entertaining an idea. They can be thinking about it, seeing it, trying to figure out a way to defend it or its strengths and weaknesses, and never actually endorse that idea. We're in a sense, we're just thinking out loud, seeing what we can come up with and talk through, but we're not really saying, yeah, I buy into that. That's very different in anything philosophical, anything argumentative, and anything ethical, moral, is that you can think and entertain a lot of things that you would never endorse. And so that's what we're doing. And so one possible answer that we could entertain to these sorts of questions is, who or what do you ultimately answer to? Me and me alone. I'm the only person that decides. Another possible answer to these style questions is that when it comes to ethics and morality, I answer to my peers. That my peers are what determine what's right and wrong, and that whatever my peers allow me to get away with, that's good stuff. Whatever my peers don't allow me to get away with, that's the bad stuff. And that they are the ones who are able to sit in judgment. And this may sound, a little strange talking about peers, but the idea is it's just social cultural groups. That's all it is a person that when we say things like what's good is what my peers will allow me to get away with and what's bad is what my peers won't allow me to get away with, what those peers could be is that could be your family unit. Like a person's parents, their siblings, their relatives of all kinds. That some people, they answer to, at least in their own mind, the only people they truly care about for approval or disapproval is, say, their immediate family and friends. And then, but there's other groups that someone will always be a member of too. Like, for example, they'll be a member, say, of a business organization. And that business organization, that's a group of your peers. Those are people you work with or you interact with. That's all peers are. Is just people you're interacting with at a given time. And typically there's some group membership associated with it. You're part of a class, like this class. We have peers in this class. But there's also, and that's one way to think about it, is when we're doing like weekly discussions, who or how do our peers interact with us? Well, if we say something that they disagree with, well, typically those people will let us know. And that's, in a sense, they're not letting us get away with something. And then the other thing is that when they agree with us, well, they're saying, good, you've got approval. And so morality could work the same way. That's the way this answer works, is that you're in a group, and whatever that group decides as a whole or the majority of that group, that's kind of what we go along with. This is familiar to us. This is our sort of representative democracy in a way where many people in the electorate or in the typical voters, they vote, and then it goes through, like if it's a presidential election, it goes through an electoral college, then we end up with presidents, or then on the lower levels, we end up with senators, representatives. That's why we have a representative democracy. People are standing in for us, but that means we're all citizens of that type of democracy, so we're part of that group. But it could also be a group, say, like I mentioned, at a business, where that business has a clearly defined code of ethics, like we saw during the first week with that ethics, that National Society of Practicing Engineers, that tidy little code of ethics. Well, that means that anybody who's an engineer that signs up for it in this country, for sure, that is the sort of standards and the norms and the values that they are held accountable to. So that's a very good example of being held accountable to a group of your peers, like other practicing engineers develop their code of ethics, and then everybody who wants to be and participate in that group has to hold to that code of ethics, and then if they fall afoul of them, well, it's going to be a group of their peers that decide. It'll be a committee that's formed that says, well, did they actually, mess up or make a mistake when some of their actions, if we compare them to these standards, these principles of ethical practice that we've all bought into. So that's a way that this can work. And what this is known as, like the first position is like a moral subjectivist. It's a person, it's got subjectivism. Don't let these ists and isms confuse you. They seem a little intimidating at first, and a lot of them show up in ethics and philosophy in general, but especially in ethics. The philosophy people love to to categorize positions. Just like, scientists categorize various animal species. Well, in philosophy, what happens is or in ethics, we have a lot of, there's certain claims and ways of thinking and reasoning that seem to fit together. And so you put a single label on that so that you refer to more than just like one word. That one word is standing in for a whole way of thinking, an outlook. It could be a theory. But in this case, these are positions that one can take. And what that means is there are some questions and someone just has an answer for it, or they assume an answer for it. They take a stand. They're like, someone says, well, who do you ultimately answer to? They say, me and only me. Well, that's taking a stance. That's making a claim, a major claim. So that would be their conclusion. And then that person may or may not have reasons to offer in support of that conclusion. They could just be chanting it, and that's not an argument. Remember, just chanting me and only me, that gets you nowhere in terms of argumentation. All that does is you just made a statement, a big, bold claim. Which big, bold claims need big, bold reasons if they're to be successful and if people want others to buy into them. And so that's why these things are positions. So one could be a moral subjectivist. Well, there's the key word is subject. That is the subject, the I or the me. That's what's going on there. Is so me is the subject. It's totally centered on the subject's wants and whims, feelings, desires, emotions, beliefs, commitments, is centered on what that individual believes for themselves, no one else. Then this one being held accountable to your peers and your groups, that's often known as a moral relativist. Sometimes this will be kind of twisted up in terms and be referred to as a cultural relativist. It's most times best to keep those two things separately, but like in our reading for this week, Rachel's kind of messes that up. What he is referring to as a cultural relativist is actually a moral relativist. That's his real target. But hey, authors make mistakes sometimes. But for our purposes, a moral relativist, that's what we're truly concerned about. And that's a person that thinks morality and the determination of rights and wrongs, goods and bads, who stands in judgment, it's relative. Like they're the individual, but their morality is based on what others have to say or think, the members of the group or their peers that they're a participant in. So morality is relative to the wants, the whims, the beliefs, the commitments, the thoughts of the group. As a whole, morality is relative to those things. The individual doesn't have the final say. The group as a whole does. That's what it means to be a relativist about morality, as you are saying that morality, or a person is saying that morality is relative to the wants and desires of someone else. Me as the subject, I don't have the final say. Others have that. Now, I can be a member of the group and contribute to that final say, but I have one voice. And there's a whole lot of other voices in play, and the majority of those voices are what's ultimately going to set the standards and the rules and stuff that even I, whether I agreed with or not, I'm going to have to in some way go along with if I want to remain a member of the group. So morality is relative to the group wants and desires, not to mine. Whereas the subjectivist is morality is totally tied to me and me alone. Well, then there's other ways, though, that people could answer these four questions. they could point to something that's beyond just individual groups. And we're definitely familiar with this. This tends to be the most common position in like ethics as it's done philosophically, is this moral objectivist position. It's extremely common, extremely widespread by theorists, especially ethical theorists. Most of them are going to be moral objectivists. And most of them, they're going to be moral objectivists, and they're definitely not going to like these sorts of groups, and they're not going to be the biggest fans of absolutists either. But an objectivist, think about it, it says objective. So subjective is like tied to a specific individual's wants and whims. Relativist is tied to a group's wants and whims, or their beliefs, their desires. It doesn't have to just be whims, it can be well thought out codes of ethics. Where they were not made lightly, a lot of effort and thought went into it. But then the objectivist is going to be that when we talk about who do we ultimately answer to, who, it's more like what, in this case of an objectivist and an absolutist. That the relativist and subjectivist, they tend to be the ones of talking about who do we ultimately answer to. An objectivist is going to be like, what do we ultimately answer to? And that could be a lot of things. Like some people would say that, and this scopes over all groups, and that all groups that we've talked about here are peer groups. Well, we're human, so our groups are going to be human as well. And so we could say that there's something beyond all of these groups, whether they're groups of practicing engineers, groups of practicing nurses, groups of, they could be all kinds of groups, like fanatical groups. They could be just our family group, the group of our friends, pretty much any kind of group you can imagine, or they can be a whole cultural group, like United States culture or South American culture, which that would probably be subdivided based on the individual countries in the larger, continent part of South America. But you could have like French culture, you could have German culture. So that's the stuff, the relativists. Those are peer groups, like you're a group of your German peers if you're in Germany. And, the moral objectivist, though, wants to go beyond that, like go supra peers. Like supra, that prefix just means beyond just our peers and just our groups. It's something that all groups and all peers, in a sense, answer to. An example of that would be something like humanity. Like that's something that goes beyond any individual human group. Like all those groups are unified under all being human and what it means to be human. That goes beyond us, as individual groups. Like the group of French citizens and, in France, that is a human group. Whereas over here in the United States, we're human too. And our culture is going to be a human culture. And so the moral objectivist is looking for things like that, something that unifies all of us across all of our groups. But keep in mind, they're saying that that's what we ultimately answer to. Now, we may also answer to some of our groups, but they don't have the final say. Remember, it's about the final say. Like, ultimately, who or what judges us for a moral objectivist? It could be humanity as a whole. This is where you get things like trials, like the Nuremberg trials, like for crimes against humanity. And think about it, that just the whole phrase of that, crimes against humanity. That's treating all humans as a whole, and if you're charged with such a crime, like some people have been, throughout various countries and cultures, that trial will be conducted by representatives from many countries, all those who have a stake in it, and some who don't. They're just sitting there as kind of supposedly impartial observers. And so that person is on trial not by a group of the people who know them or in the same community, like, think U.S. criminal trials or whatever, where you have a trial of your peers is, people who are from that district or that county. Those are people sitting on the jury. Whereas in a crimes against humanity trial, you'll have representatives from whole different countries than your own. So say that you're being charged, you're from, say, I don't know, Spain, and you've been brought forth on charges of some crimes against humanity. Well, there may be French people on the jury, or, the board, however they set it up. The committee, that's the easiest way to say it. The committee that's assessing the data to see are you guilty or innocent of this charge. It could be from France, from the United States. It could be from various countries in Africa. It could be, and it will certainly be, people from the country that you're supposedly guilty of committing these acts against. But it will also be people from all over the rest of the world. So it's like humanity is represented and humanity is judging you. So, they're determining, did you do something bad or good? And see, a crime against humanity, that sets up as like, that's a sort of a big deal. That's big trials. And that's kind of where the objectivist is going. They're looking for things like that. But it doesn't have to be just humanity. It could be life itself. It could be the biosphere. It could be something that all adult humans share, like rationality. In general, we'll encounter a person that thinks that way later this semester. But it can also be other things, like the consequences of the actions we did. They could have impinged upon many, many, many people, and so the majority of those people counts as this super peer group. Like, we may never have signed in to be a member of this majority group, but our actions had consequences for that majority of people, so now they are the ones who are judging us. It's beyond the people we know and where we live. That's the notion of super peers. We get judged by something beyond just our immediate family, beyond our immediate culture. It could be people from groups not of our own. That is the super peers, the moral objectivist, and we'll see examples of this throughout this video. Then there is this sort of answer, that who or what ultimately do we answer to? Well, it's something uber peers. Like, this is well beyond peers. This is something that is not necessarily even human anymore. This is your moral absolutist. And the hallmark of this is typically the moral absolutist is something that no person can control. No individual has any control on what this uber peer thing is. It's like a divine being. It's beyond our ability to do anything about it. Our whims and wants and all human cultural groups, all of them answer to this thing. And so typically the moral objectivist there'll be a religious component built in or a spiritual component built in. Doesn't have to be, but typically it is. And we'll encounter a moral absolutist also later this semester. And then the final way that these sorts of questions might be answered is in terms of, it could just be a conglomerate, a mishmash, a moral mishmash, a hybrid where an individual could, depending on the exact scenario, the context, could kind of think that that scenario is held accountable to me and only me. But then the different scenario they may think has something to do with, humanity as a whole. Whereas they may think a totally different scenario, whatever action or decision is morally at stake, it's a question. Was that okay to do? And that may be something that's determined by the peer groups or my peers that I'm members of, my culture. And then also, they may also buy into, depending on what the actual deed or the action or decision was or the value at stake, well, that might be determined by, a divine being, a God or whatever, something well beyond all humans. And so you could have one person that would buy into all four of these relative to the situation and time and place. And as people might suspect, this tends to be what most folks are, is this moral mishmash. It's unfortunate as far as us, analyzing various arguments and passages, because we have to be very careful that sometimes a person may be assuming a relativistic position about some moral issue or ethical issue. Sometimes they may be a moral absolutist, and those may not be in alignment. You can get a lot of contradictions, a lot of inconsistencies with moral mishmash, but this is all too human. The idea is one thing to definitely notice throughout this semester is ethics and morality and value conflicts. They are not easy. They are very complex. And all we're doing is this gives us another little handle, another way to cut through the clutter to try to figure out what people like. If a person actually is taking up a subjectivist stance about a moral issue, and we can recognize that, oh, yeah, that's subjectivist, well, then that's good because that limits it. That eliminates these possibilities. We don't have to worry about mishmash problems. And so we can focus on their argumentation from that subjectivist lens, and we can be charitable based on the perspective or lens that we know that there's implied by the reasoning. And then moreover, we have lines of analysis, lines of critique, lines of attack. We can start, ratcheting on their reasoning and testing it. So, in terms of what is easier to deal with, well, arguments where the author has assumed some of these straightforward positions. What is more difficult to deal with is when the author is this. And that does happen. It happens all the time in everyday life. But it's much tidier. Like, for example, the moral relativist, think back to those codes of ethics. And I mentioned that the very first week that if you have a nice, tidy code of ethics that everybody kind of buys into and accepts, and that's what everybody's supposed to answer to, and everybody knows that that's what they're supposed to answer to, regardless of what they might personally think or feel about their action, they know that their action is ultimately going to be assessed by the group based on that code of ethics. That's so much more straightforward. Everybody knows the rules that are in play. And that gives us a clear line of sight on being able to make a clear, a good or reasonable assessment, a plausible assessment. Whereas if we're just in everyday life and someone or some group is accusing another of doing something bad and that group is like a mishmash, ooh, what a mess. Like I said, this should seem familiar. And so let's talk about these a little more in detail. That I've given these sort of working definitions of the way these groups answer these 4 questions. And so I would encourage people, definitely take the time to read through these things carefully, think about them, and generate some examples of how this works. And we'll do so as we work through this. But the moral subjectivism as a position, we already know that if someone is a moral subjectivist or they're assuming this sort of position, they're all about me. It's me, me, me. And so that's why it's in parentheses, me, with an exclamation point. And that'll keep it straight for you. The moral subjectivist is all about me. As far as ethics and morality go, who's the final judge? Me, and only me. And then with relativism, just to get a good sense, overview of this stuff is moral relativism. Who's ultimately the judge, the jury, the executioner in terms of saying, yep, you messed up. Or the person who does rewards. That is going to be we. That is the group, some group of people, your peers. And you're a member of that. So you're part of that we, but your voice is one amongst many. And the group can go totally differently than you as the me would want it to go. That we're held accountable to others beyond ourselves. And then the moral objectivism, you can think of that as a we plus. That's like humanity. So it's not just we, the French citizens. It's like we, the French citizens, as members of humanity, or as members of nature, or as members of a rational species, as a species that can give and receive and understand reasoning. So we plus, that's moral objectivism. And then the moral absolutism, that's the it. That's like something beyond all the humans. It's out there. And that's our judge and jury. For morality and ethics, at least. And then there's also, though, this moral mishmash, and notice, according immediately, what a mess. It's me plus we plus it and the kitchen sink. I mean, you never know what you're going to get. And this tends to be what many people are. And so, woo, I'm emphasizing that because it will become extremely relevant as we go through and we're considering it. And we'll see it throughout the weekly discussions. Is that different people read argumentation, well, differently. There is a core argument always in play. There is something the author intended, but it's totally possible for people to develop varying interpretations of that reasoning and react to their own interpretation when that may not have been the author's intent, or it could be totally a plausible way, even if the author didn't intend it, what someone's interpretation could be what's implied by that reasoning. So it's never just the words alone. And so just to do some thinking here, well, the moral subjectivist, I won't read through all of this, but the individual ultimately answers to him or herself alone. A good thing about this is an individual can have like discussions in their own head or their own heart. Like they can do some self-reflection, some moral inventory. They can say, okay, I'm the only judge of my actions. So what kind of person do I actually want to be? And then they can develop their own personal values, disvalues, their moral truths for them as individuals. And they don't expect anybody else to hold these same things. Excuse me. Maybe other people do, but the subjectivist doesn't have to care. That person does not have to care what someone else happens to think. In terms of morality, they don't ask others what they should think. They figure it out for themselves and then act accordingly. But negotiations are possible. It's like a subjectivist could really buy into the notion that kicking puppies is very wrong. Or that kicking any little innocent furball animal is very wrong. And the subjectivist could hold to that for years and years and years. But then later in life, they come along and they say, well, I don't really like puppies anymore and I don't like kittens. So maybe it's not really bad to kick them around. I mean, this is a kind of just made up example, but it gives you a sense that the subjectivists can do negotiations in their own head. They can think these things out. They can, change at whim. That's the thing of an individual. Some people, would say that humans are fickle creatures, that things we consider good one day could be perceived as bad the next. And that's true. It could happen in one day where our whole perspective could change, especially if you think about cases of argumentation where we may start out thinking that a person is innocent of some crime, but then as the lawyers keep talking, our mind changes, well, maybe that person did do something wrong. Or we initially, we prejudge the situation. We have a prejudice, a prejudgment. That person is guilty. They've been accused, so surely they're guilty. But then as we start listening to the data, the evidence, the arguments made by the lawyers, our view changes. So that's the way this can happen, is that we can be, as subjectivists, could be influenced by others, but in the end, they're the one that decides for themselves. Like they cast the verdict, like a jury member. That regardless of the influence of others, at the end of the day, they have their own yay or nay vote, and that's theirs and theirs alone to hold and to have. They have ultimate freedom to make whatever call they want to make. They also have ultimate responsibility for whatever they make. They have no one else to blame but themselves. They also have no one else to praise but themselves. That's a hallmark of this subjectivist, but just keep in mind that they can do negotiations. They can change. Sometimes, though, it can just be a whim, as I feel like, it's good to be kind today, and then 5 minutes from now, I feel like it's good to be mean. And there could be no difference between the people one person that I was kind to has done nothing different than the person I was mean to, but it was just based on how I felt at that very moment. That's the way moral subjectivism can work. They can have different standards for other people than they hold themselves to as well. One of the sort of interesting examples to consider is like a cutting in line scenario. That you could have a moral subjectivist that goes and say there's a line with 100 people waiting to buy, like, say, concert tickets or movie tickets. Then the moral subjectivist could go and say we have Sally standing in line. And, the subjectivist walks in front and just cuts right in front of Sally and takes a place in front of line, right in front of her. And then we can imagine Sally's response, Sally may be like, well, what are you doing? Do you think it's right to cut in front of people? Well, the moral subjectivist could say, well, I think it's right for me to cut in front of people. And then so Sally can be like, oh, well, I'll just cut back in front of you and then hop right back in front of him. And then, Sally say, well, what do you think about that? Well, the moral subjectivist could say, and be consistent with this position. That's the interesting thing about this position. That the moral subjectivist could say, oh, but you just did something wrong to me by cutting in front of me. And Sally could be like, what? How, if you think that it's okay for people to cut in front of line, that it would be right for you to do it and wrong for me to do it back to you? And the moral subjectivist could be totally consistent and say, well, I didn't say I thought it was right for people in general to cut in line. I said that I thought it was okay for me to do it. But that does not mean I think that it's okay for other people to do it. And think about how frustrating it would be to have this discussion with the moral subjectivist. But realize if one of them did that, it's totally consistent with the position. That it can change on a dime. And it can have like double standards. We talk about someone having double standards, that they think is okay for them to do it, but not for you to do it. That's that double standard notion we're aware of. Moral subjectivists can absolutely have this. Well, why? Because they only answer to themselves, to their individual self. And if that individual self makes the dictate that it's okay for me to do something and not others, well, then that's the end of it. And from their own point of view, they will be right or wrong, morally good, morally bad, as long as they're doing that. As long as they're doing whatever they think is right or wrong at a given moment. And so the I reigns supreme in all matters of morality and ethics. And definitely read through this. These words say it, in a more condensed format, but I'm providing examples so we have a sense of these positions. Sometimes words on page are never quite good enough to really understand. That's a theme, notice, throughout this class, that the words are not all that's happening. It's the implication and the examples underneath them that matters too. And so moral relativists, well, they ultimately answer to their peers, their group. And those could be families, they could be employers, they could be professional societies that you're a member of. You could be, your peers could be the whole group of American nurses. Or it could be the whole group of American social workers. Or the whole group of French, the French nurses. It could be whatever, whole groups. And it could be lawmakers in the case that, like I said, we're in like a representative democracy and we have a particular sort of legal system, with lower courts and upper courts, or higher courts, like Supreme Courts at the top and then all the others, all the way down to just county courts and judges. And so in a sense, like something can be legal but not necessarily moral, and something could be immoral but not illegal. Legal and morality are not the same thing, or ethical and legal, they don't have to line up. As we see sometimes people, become upset with various laws that they would consider to be unethical, even though it's a law, which by definition, if it is a law in the books, it's legal. So, but we could be answerable to lawmakers, like some laws have morality embedded in them. It's not just about everybody getting along. Like some laws seem to contain moral judgments or value judgments underneath them. And an example would be, that people would be familiar with is like same-sex marriage. There were laws about what a marriage was to count as legally. And then there's various tax laws. It's all huge amount of laws. But the idea is, well, people, same-sex folks that wanted to marry, well, the idea was like, but that's wrong. We're being done wrong. There's a discrimination that's taking place here. So that's a challenge not to the legality of the law, but the morality of the law. And then it just happens to be, well, the only way we can fix that in this country is to do things like Supreme Court, and I'm not saying that there was something morally right or wrong about the laws as far as same-sex marriage goes. We're just entertaining these ideas right now. I'm just describing the thought process. So with moral relativism, here's a way to think about it. If the law that made marriage to mean a certain thing was immoral, it could have been moral for as long as it was in place, but then as soon as a group starts challenging a law, that it can actually, the morality of the whole nation can morph and change along with that. So laws, the group of lawmakers, there is an influence in terms of morality at times. But that's who the moral relativist ultimately answers to, is groups. And there can be in the head and heart, as well as in group negotiations, are possible. Like groups of people in one group can talk and negotiate and actually change the minds of each other. So moral relativism by no means says that one group's moral view and value system always has to be the same. No, cultures develop over time. Any group does. Like, just think through our own families and how our parents or brothers or sisters, initially we may as a family unit have been kind of opposed to something. But then throughout time, we've talked, we've learned with others outside of the group, and then we bring that back into the group, and then it changes and continues down the line. So moral relativists leave room for moral change can happen. But now it can also be extremely static too. That and we'll see that when we look at the strengths and the weaknesses, that relativism that a group could have a very clear and rigid set and understanding of values. And those values may not change over time. And ultimately, as long as you're a member of that group, and you're going along with the values, disvalues, the goods, bads listed by the group, well, that's who you answer to, so you're doing good. If you step out of line, you're doing bad. And you're doing, notice, objectively good or objectively bad, in that it's not your own whims. Relativism is not subjectivism. That if you're a member of a group and you buy into that group has authority over you, in terms of morality, then what that group says goes, whether you buy into it or not. If you are not in the majority and making the decisions, your position was not, your action is deemed bad by the majority, then it's bad, regardless of what you as an individual think. So there's some objectivity there. There's some distance from the individual there. But it's relative to the group. It's not something outside of the group that's judging. It's the group internal. It's like internal business, like in-house. That's the way to think of relativism and morality. Moral objectivism. Yeah, I've given examples of this. It's like we plus, that groups of humans absolutely matter, but the idea is that when it comes to morality, there's something out there beyond just our groups, like something that scopes over French citizens, U.S. citizens, Australian folks, wherever. It's like a person could be in the middle of the African continent and they would still be just as human as somebody over in New Jersey. So the moral objectivist is always relying on something beyond individual human groups to make the call when it comes to, did someone, a member of the human species, did they do right or wrong? Well, that person, that's going to be determined by looking outwards rather than in the group. And so things can be like nature, life, like we're all living creatures. Typically, morality doesn't apply to rocks and, like dirt. It's like we don't talk about the ethics of that rock bashing into the other rock. No, we don't. With that, typically, morality and ethics tends to be a living creature phenomenon. Remember, it's tied up with hurts and harms. And then, all one has to do is wonder, well, can a rock really be hurt in some physical pain, biological sense? It can be broken, but does it feel pain because it was broken? The sort of consensus at this moment, until maybe science will learn more and we'll discover more, at the moment, rocks don't get hurt. And so we don't really have rock morality to worry about. But, maybe we will one day, but not today. Especially now when we start talking about things like artificial intelligence and smart, like the idea of neural networks and stuff. Some of the things I work with, that at times, eventually in the future, it's not beyond possible. It could be that there's some possibility down that road. Whether that's good or bad, remember, we're not doing that right now. There could be something more than just humanity. So it could be life itself, or say intelligence, like AI or synthetic intelligence and human intelligence. Those could be different. And so eventually a moral objectivist could say, well, how do we figure out if someone did that artificial intelligent machine wrong? Well, we have to go to this notion of what does it mean to harm an intelligence, regardless if it's human. So you see, this objectivism leaves room to grow too. All of these positions, they typically have some room to grow. And so, so nature, life, humanity, this is what, when we say, who do we ultimately answer to, a moral objectivist is going to say something like humanity, or it could be consistency or rationality. These come up a lot with philosophy people than ethicists, philosophical ethicist people about moral objectivism. Most of the authors we encounter out of our textbook, they are this. And so the standard is something like rationality. And if you want an example of how this plays out, how a moral objectivist narrows things down, is you can check out that article in our textbook by Connor Regan, one of the two, that it is how not to answer moral questions. That gives you a good sense of how the moral objectivist doesn't buy into all these other sorts of things, that they're relying on like rationality itself to be the judge of what's right and wrong, good and bad. And so negotiations are still possible, though, even within the moral objectivist. But this is where it gets really interesting, that how do you negotiate with life or humanity? That seems abstract. It's not for the moral objectivists. They consider it to be very, very real. But how would you negotiate with that? Well, say that, to go back to that crimes against humanity. An example of a crime against humanity, has involved things like a ruler of a country that puts like some poisonous gas across some portion of the population. For whatever reason, they disagreed with the ruler, they were the wrong group, according to that ruler's point of view. This is not to make light of these actions, but it's just to say it tends to be, why was the gassing done? It'll be something like, well, they were a dissenting group in some kind of way. They didn't agree or buy into whatever the ruler, the dictator, the authority that had control of the gas, whether it's a military leader or whatever, that they didn't seem to be buying into whatever was being sold by the ruler. And so they were gassed. Well, the idea is, in a crime against humanity trial, that could very well be something, because it's something that would be so atrocious. If any humans, it doesn't matter that person just gassed this one group. It's like so offensive. It's what sometimes is called inhumane, where you're negating human. That humans, in this kind of moral objectivist picture, being a member of the human species matters. It gives you some rights, some authority. It gives you some entitlements. Just your membership alone, namely the right not to be gassed by someone just because they want to do that. It doesn't matter who that person is. It doesn't matter what group you're in. It's just wrong. Well, how can that be? Who's the judge? Well, it has to be humanity itself. It has to be this thing beyond all our groups, at least according to the moral objectivist. But then think about it. How could you negotiate that? Well, think sometimes about scientific interventions, how science, we modify our biology. We change our immunities, and then there's various people that are advocates of what's known as transhumanism, like moments in time where we go beyond our current biological capabilities as humans. Whether through technology or through learning or medical advances, whatever. And so the idea is if some point in the future we could make humans pretty much immune to any kind of poisonous gas, well, it would no longer be a poisonous gas. So would it still be a crime against humanity if we have a ruler that dumps some gas on top of people, but nobody's really hurt by it? Why? Because humans have biologically been altered. So maybe it won't be a crime against humanity anymore. Maybe it's just an annoyance. Kind of like people live in cities and there's exhaust fumes from cars, and most of the time people won't tend to say, yeah, I'm being done morally badly because all these cars are polluting the environment that I happen to live in. No, that person lives in that area. They know that the car exhaust is part of being in a larger city, and it doesn't mean that it's a good thing necessarily, but it means that it's acceptable. It's not considered immoral. Now, some environmentalists might disagree with that, but there are, that we're just gaining a sense, to make this seem plausible. Well, the idea is, well, say the same eventually happens with, like, nobody seems to immediately die or suffer tremendously from smog. Now, some people do. They develop respiratory problems and asthma if it gets too bad. But the idea is, say one day we get beyond that. We change our respiratory systems biologically and medically so that things that are poison gas today isn't a poison gas to us in the future. So if some ruler decides to unload, their barrels of gas onto a group of people, oh yeah, it may still be a mean thing to do, but it may not be a crime against humanity anymore. Because people may get the sniffles, but nobody really, dies or has any long-lasting effects. I'm not saying this will happen in the future, but that's something, a way to think about how even the moral objectivists can grow in time. That they're responsive, especially if they pick humanity as the standard, or even rationality. What counts as being rational or logical could change in time. Like, especially in like philosophy with logic and stuff, that I can definitely say, as I've worked in that area with logic and inference and implication, and we learn things every day. So the standards of rationality do change in time. So there's room for negotiations. It's possible, even if it's these big notions. Then the next thing is like the moral absolutist. Who do we answer to? Well, it's an it of some form, according to a moral absolutist. This will be the whole of humanity and all creatures great and small across the entire universe. Ultimately answer to some form of non-human. It's supreme. This is the notion of the uber peer group. This is a supreme beyond, like uber is like super. So, just so people know that, so they're not confused. Supra is just beyond, something beyond groups. Uber is like something supremely beyond groups. It's more intensive, way beyond, not even of the same species necessarily. And that's why you got things like this, that, for example, all creatures could ultimately be said to answer to a god, Allah, a whole divine pantheon, like a conglomerate or a collective, a committee of gods. Could be an alien collective, could be something out there. There are people who would say that that's ultimately what determines morality. But keep in mind that with this, negotiations aren't really possible. It's like, just think, in terms of religion or spirituality, sometimes negotiations are possible, but many times they're not. Especially if it's what's known as an orthodox practice rather than an orthoprax. So orthodox is where you have the right rules, like the right principles. Like, these are dictates that have been laid down, like God said so, sort of maneuvers. Like thou shalt not kill. That's like a dictate. That's like an imperative statement to, if you go sideways of that, you've done something wrong. Why? Because God says so. And that's the end of it. There's really no negotiation. It's not like a person can go up to the thou shalt not kill notion and say, well, I don't know about that, God. It's not like you get that mainline, real time communication and negotiation. It's not, even over time. That's the whole idea with religions. They tend to be pretty stable on their core tenets. That's what keeps them unified. Sure, there can be branches like all the Protestant, if we're talking about Christianity, there's lots of Protestants, Jehovah Witness, Methodist, Baptist, well, not Catholic. Catholic wouldn't be Protestant. But, other things. Tons and tons and tons. Church of God, there's plenty. And so there can be various permutations. But then at the end of the day, all of those groups, though, when the question is asked, who do you ultimately answer to about your action, your decision, that someone was hurt or they wasn't with? God or Allah. Or it could be a divine collective. It could be other things. We know there's variations. But it's going to be something that's not really human. It's going to be beyond human. That's another way you could think about this, is it's beyond human, way beyond, not same species. It could be, I guess, depending on the particular religious spiritual perspective, but typically not. Typically it's beyond, way beyond. And that's not passing judgment or saying anything negative about it. It's just that's the way this position tends to work itself out. At least the way that philosophy people and ethicists understand it. This is for us, the way it's a working notion. And negotiations, they're not really possible. You don't really, call up, whoever on the phone, the alien collective, and say, I don't really like this rule. What can we do about that? Yeah, no, it's more like the collective says you do X, and if you don't do it, it doesn't matter what you want. It don't matter what all of humanity wants. If you go against it, you've done wrong. That's this sort of notion. The divine reigns supreme in all matters of ethics and morality and everything else. That's the whole notion of a divine system, is it scopes over everything, not just morality. So that's the notion of absolute, is like absolute range of influence, absolute control and authority over all things. Your reign is absolute. There's anyone who deviates from it is wrong, and that's it. And it's not negotiable typically. And we've all encountered, folks that think this way and stuff, that some things just are unforgivable. Or maybe everything's forgivable, but it has to be done by that divine being. That, humans, you can't be forgiven by humanity as a whole and it still be good if that divine thing said nope, and you went sideways of it. At this point, if we could just stick with these four, like the me, the we plus, if we could just stick with me, we plus, and even the absolutist, things would be easier. And for our work, like applying that philosophical pattern of inquiry, all of that would be easier. But the lives we live, either fortunately or unfortunately, it could go either way, they tend to be complicated. And the way that works is that we get moral mishmashes, where we have hybrids, and there's examples of this. Like, for example, with abortion, one person, this could all happen in the same individual. One person may think that they ultimately answer to a divine being in regards to abortion. It could be something like, thou shalt not kill. And so, they view abortion as a form of killing, and the divine being says, I shall not do it, so if I did it, I'm wrong. That same person, though, could buy into it's okay to like the morality of executing a serial killer or a serial rapist or whatever. That our humanity decides. That could be a crime against humanity, so it's okay to kill in that context. But it's not okay to kill in abortion context. One individual buys into an absolutist position while at the same time an objectivist position. And then they can also be totally subjective about something else, like whether someone is mean to someone they don't like. Well, that individual has to work that out for themselves. Like, they're the ones who have to have their conscience and have a conversation with their own conscience. That they may or may not feel guilty, but perhaps they should. And see, that can be one individual that holds these various positions all at the same time, a moral mishmash. And just you can read through these examples, like lying. That someone could think that lying, we answer to the group that we lied to. It never goes up to the divine, up the ladder to divine stuff. That lying is more of a human concern. The divine doesn't have time to worry with that. That's just one way to think about it. But this tends to be common. Lots and lots and lots of us will be this at times, but it makes things more difficult. In terms of identifying, where does someone actually stand? Like, what are their reasons actually depending on? Because depending on who they think they answer to on that particular topic, that can determine the sorts of values, disvalues that are in play at that moment. Like, life could be uber valuable when we're talking about abortion. But life may not be uber valuable. It may actually be a disvalue, and death is more valuable when we're talking about serial killers. Just keep that in mind. And we will walk slowly through this stuff, so we this semester, so that we try to minimize how rough it is to deal with the mishmash. But it's just, that's the reason we're talking about it now. We're priming our minds for things like this. Sometimes things are simple, sometimes they're not. That's the message of the moral mishmash. So some of the pros and cons of each position. It's good to know these. These are what's most relevant to understanding their argumentation. And like, in terms of its strengths and weaknesses, like, if someone bases an argument on one of these metaethical positions, what might be an immediate weakness they have to account for? Immediate objections. Or what might be a strong part that if they base their argument, it's like resting on top of one of these metaethical positions. What about their argument do we probably not want to try to critique or work with because it's super strong? It's not a weak point. And so knowing these pros and cons, that helps us with that. So one thing about the moral subjectivist is moral subjectivism, it provides ultimate freedom. So if you're dealing with a moral subjectivist and their reasons are based on the notion of freedom, like personal choice, autonomy, things like that, you don't really want to hammer on that, because that's just fundamental to the position. That subjectivist is never going to bend on that. That's just part of what it means to be a subjectivist. They value freedom above all else. So it doesn't really do any good to, try to lean on their reasons that have to do with freedom. You need to lean on their other reasons if you want to, maybe upend their argument or something. Or if you want to make it stronger, well, they're already perfectly strong with ultimate freedom. You don't need to strengthen the notion of freedom for them. They already have that. You need to strengthen the other things. And so ultimate freedom, control, and power, essentially it's whatever you want, whenever you want. And that is the truth about moral subjectivism. If you think it's right, if a subjectivist thinks it's right for them at that moment, then it is right for them at that moment. Why? Well, because they think it is. And it is that simple. That they don't think anyone can say one way or another. I mean, people can say they've done something wrong, but the moral subjectivist doesn't have to buy into it. Typically, a moral subjectivist, a lot of times, this is one of the cons of it, is if people who have been kind of thinking about this is a position that could be extremely selfish at times. It could be like the position taken by someone who doesn't really care a whole lot about other people. And so it could be that sort of outsider, the serial killer, the bad person. But it doesn't have to be. Keep that in mind. It could be someone who just doesn't buy into what other people have to think or say. They have their own way of seeing the world. Oh, well, what others think. They don't answer to some larger humanity, to some divine thing. They answer only to themselves. But with that, ultimate freedom, as all cases of freedom, comes ultimate responsibility. If a subjectivist messes up, it's on them. They can't blame anybody else. They have to take total responsibility. It's just the inherent nature. So in some sense, it's the ultimate of personal responsibility. While at the same, we often use that notion of personal responsibility to mean that a person should take responsibility when they mess up in regards to the group. But in this case, it's not making a mistake in regards to a group, it not doing what they were supposed to do as the group is laid out. It's that the person could make a mistake in regards to what they wanted their own self to be like. Own self, that's a little rough to say, but what they envision, their ideals, their plans, their goals for their self. And people can mess that up sometimes. And so but who holds them responsible? That individual. And also that although the whims of a subjectivist, I've emphasized this, how one moment it can be one thing, the next it could be something else, there can be double standards. Although these things can change from moment to moment, the moral subjectivist has maximal consistency on their side in that they can consistently be inconsistent. They can make it up as they go along, and that's just what it means to be a subjectivist. They're not being inconsistent when they think kicking puppies is bad one day, and then the next they think that it's okay, that it could be good. They're not being inconsistent with themselves. They're just being themselves, and that's all it takes to be a moral subjectivist. If they think something's good for them, if a person thinks it's good for them at that moment, then it's good for them, period. Why? Because they're the only one. They set what's good and bad for, their individual self. Some people may or may not like this, but it is the position, and some people would say that it's practically untenable, that no one is a complete island, that we live within cultures, we live within groups, and in order to get along, this person has to accept that others have authority over them at times. Like doing whatever you want, whenever you want, that tends to not work too well in our current, contemporary societies. But the subjectivists, though, their response to something like practically untenable is to say, well, yeah, maybe I have to behave as if I listen to what other people think, and I think that I have to behave as if they can judge me. But personally, I don't buy into it. I behave as if something has authority over me just to get along with other people, because I deem it worthwhile to be able to get along. But I don't have to actually buy into that. I can still ultimately be committed that me and only me is the deciding factor always and in all things. But I can behave as if. Sometimes that's not the case, and so they have ways. None of these positions are weak. Even the parts that are maybe cons, all that means is there are things that if one wants to defend a position like this, they need to be able to explain these cons away. They need to be able to emphasize the strengths and explain the cons away. And then another one is that a lot of, especially, objectivists, even the relativists, they'll often often imply at least that a subjectivist is naive to think that the world just works this way. There's an objectivist or an absolutist would be there's overwhelming evidence that we do ultimately answer to something beyond just our own whims, desires, emotions at any given time, and that anyone that thinks otherwise, they're just not thinking properly. So the subjectivist, of course, can respond to that. I'm not saying this is a good response, but they can always say that, you may think my position is naive, but I don't think so, and I'm the ultimate judge. But then that kind of, how can you even talk to someone like that? It's like this can turn into a sort of chanting thing at times. And so that's why this is typically not considered the most favorable position in terms of ethics and morality as it's done inside, philosophy and everyday life and corporations. But it is definitely a position that people hold. And so whether it has to be practically tenable in some way because many people seem to hold it. But think about it. Those are just some of the pros and cons. Ultimate freedom, but you get ultimate responsibility in return. You got maximal consistency, but being inconsistent, you can do double standards. There's nothing wrong with them as long as the subjectivist doesn't think there's anything wrong with them. But now, what could this turn into? Like the moral subjectivist could be, well, this could be a position taken up by someone like a serial killer. And the downside of it is that we're not really able to exert authority over that person. That if they never think they did anything wrong, then as far as they're concerned, they never did. Regardless of what anybody outside says about them. They don't have to accept any of it, especially if they buy in that they're the only one they answer to. You can't reach that person. That their mind, maybe negotiations are possible, but only if that person negotiates in their own head. That, like us on the outside looking in, regardless of what happens to the person, whatever we do in response to their actions, they may never accept it. That's just the nature of the position. Then there's moral relativism. This gives you a little more, like others share the burden. It's like you're not totally responsible for morality. If you're a moral relativist, well, you're a group. The majority makes the decision. You're a member of the group. You're a member of the we. But you ultimately, you don't have to worry about every action you take as long as you learn the rules of the game. So remember, a relativist could be something like, you're a member of the National Society of Practicing Engineers. And the idea is, well, every engineer has these sort of standards. You buy into these values, or you at least accept them. And as long as you're not falling afoul of them, hey, you're moral. So all your responsibility as an individual member or participant in that group is to learn and understand. You have to understand the rules, and then you obey the rules, and you're moral. You get it for free just by simply doing right. And fortunately, many of these rules have already been made by other people. You're not responsible for reinventing the whole wheel for yourself. That burden is placed across the whole community or the group or the culture. And so that's kind of nice. But now the thing is that culture, that group, that majority set of shared values and principles and standards, if it says you're not supposed to be dishonest in your dealings with others, and you are dishonest in your dealings with someone, well, then you're going to be judged wrong. You'll be immoral, regardless if you think you were bad for being dishonest. That does not matter. What we as individual members of the group think, we have a voice, but we do not have control. Not total control. That's in the majority of the group. We're not totally free, but we're not totally responsible either. There's also could be a lot of empirical scientific support for this. Like anthropologists talk about it. Maybe not for moral relativism. This is where the distinction between cultural and moral relativism comes into play. Cultural relativism is an anthropological theory that the value systems and disvalue systems, standards, principles, those can vary across cultures. It's just an empirical observation that a tribe in the northern Arctic may have a different value system, maybe not entirely different from the one we have, in South Carolina. But it could be different. And it's just an observation that they may find, like seals, for example, could have a much higher value for them as a food source than we here that have cows and pigs and chickens and stuff for fruits and vegetables, whereas up in the frozen tundra, fruits and vegetables are not the same. That's just values in terms of what's edible or desirable as far as consumption. But then it can also be things, like, and we'll see an example of this in your reading for this week, of like there could be very different marriage practices. Marriage could be totally differently, the obligations, responsibilities. It could be the way that elderly are dealt with. In some cases, some cultures, the elderly are revered, and you supply houses for your elderly, an income long beyond when they were able to generate an income for themselves. We still look after them. Why? Because there's a wisdom there. They've paid their dues, as sometimes is said, and they deserve respect and care and compassion. Well, in some tribes, if resources are scarce and the elderly tends to be slower, we can't move, we're a nomadic civilization, well, then it may be that we have it where the elderly are supposed to sacrifice themselves for the good of the tribe. We give the resources to the next generation rather than the previous. That can be in certain tribes, absolutely. And see, cultural relativism is a theory that just makes that observation that, don't think that every group thinks the same way your group does. That not every group sees the world the same way. Well, that's just an observation. That does not tell us the moral status, though. Now, some cultural relativist anthropologists, they took a foray off into ethics and started making claims about morality, and then that's getting a little iffy. But remember, the moral relativist is just that our morality, we answer to the group for rights and wrongs, goods and bads, which that may vary across cultures. Sure, it may across groups. But remember, with a moral relativist, the group doesn't have to just be a culture. It could be a family. It could be a whole nation. It could be a lot of things. So, and the cultural anthropologists need not say, it's just implied in what they say that the morality may differ if their eating practices differ, and their marriage practices differ. Why wouldn't you think morality would too? Well, maybe it does. But that's an observation is different than someone who actually buys into this kind of position and says, yes, that's the way it actually is. It's different, in terms of, and other people that think otherwise, like the subjectivists over here, they think they answer only to their individual self, but in fact, they really answer to their culture, their community. See, that's different than saying that cultures vary. Of course they do. We know that today. We didn't know that at one time. But today, different people have different practices. So cultural relativism is making a much more benign claim. It's just an empirical observation. Whereas moral relativism is actually making a truth claim about how morality works. That this person believes that morality, they answer to their peers, not just their individual self. And that people who think that they only answer to their individual self could be mistaken. That's different than just saying people differ. It's something to keep in mind. But there is potentially some empirical support. There's like an experimentalist ethics branch in philosophy that actually does test on this. It tests how people respond based off of their group membership. Like, does their behavior and what they perceive as right and wrong, does it vary based off of the group they're in at a given time? Do they actually buy into a relativistic picture, even if they think they may be buying into subjectivism or objectivism or whatever? So there is some data. There's data for support of this. It's also touted oftentimes as being open-minded, very accepting, tolerant of others. It can be if your group is. If your group is all about learning about other groups and trying to get along with them and collaborating, sure, it can be. It can also be very intolerant and very close-minded. Like, we see this, it says it's often touted, meaning that it's sold, the selling point. Like, like commercial style thing that, this is open-minded, this is accepting and tolerant, but it doesn't have to be. Remember, all this position is the morality is relative to what the majority in the group decides. Well, your group could be a group of, human cannibals. And so they may be very, close-minded about not eating people. Eating people is a part of the group, and anybody that doesn't want to eat people, well, there's something weird with them. They don't see the world the right way. This could be very nationalistic. It's like, that some people, like in the, a U.S. person could think that certain other cultures, like they see what they do with like, for example, requiring body and head coverings for women. That in the U.S., sometimes some people will want to say that, yeah, that's like oppressing, the women in that culture and all that. But we can't, all that we can say from a moral relativistic picture, though, is that it would be bad if that was done here. If it is, in fact, a form of oppression, then this culture seems to, consider oppression the disvalue. And so it would be bad for us to do that here, but it may not be bad for other people to do it over in their culture. See, that's what the relativist has to be willing to accept. Like, this is a very important aspect, that sometimes moral relativism requires people who hold its position to accept that certain practices that might initially seem bad for everyone might in fact be good for some groups, and vice versa. So there could be open marriages where in some cultures you could have a husband-wife pairing, but then the husbands shared with other wives and the wives shared with other husbands, and everybody's fine with that. And so even though that may look bad from, say, a point of view standing in, say, the United States or in Australia, a moral relativist, a consistent one, has to be willing to accept that, yeah, that could actually be good for those people. If that group thinks it's good, then it is good for them. It's relative to the group. They only answer to the group. We're not their group, so they don't answer to us. That we don't have to worry about their stuff because they don't answer to our groups. We don't have to worry about what they do. They do what they do. We do what we do. What's good for them? If they think it's good, it is good for them. If something's bad, we think it's bad for us, then it's bad for us. They can't come over here and tell us, pass judgment on us. We can't pass judgment on them. You see, it may not be really possible in a morally relativistic picture to pass judgment across groups. Like, each group is the island. Whereas a subjectivist, it's like the individual's the island, and no one can really change or do anything with the subjectivist's mind that the subjectivist don't want done with his or her mind. Well, the moral relativist could be the same way. That's how it could be closed-minded, that it's totally possible to think, yep, what's good for us is what our group thinks is good for us, and what's bad for us is what our group thinks is bad for us, and we don't have to care about what other groups have to say. And so there's a lot of examples where, these tend to be sort of objections that people launch against moral relativism. These are some of the cons, is that if one wants to be a consistent moral relativist, say you're in your group and you think that infant sacrifice is terrible, like throwing babies in the volcano to appease, the Vulcan gods. If you think that is morally terrible, if you're a consistent relativist, all you can say is that would be morally terrible if we were to do it here, given our values and our, moral standards. But it could be totally perfectly okay for the people, overdoing it in some other group. It could be totally good for them to do it. They could be totally moral. They're not acting immorally by their own standards. They would be acting immorally if they were to do that here, but they're not by doing it over there. And so blood transfusions are another example. Like some typically, religious or spiritual groups would consider blood transfusions to be, an evil, a bad thing. Whereas in, typical, a lot of, say U.S. culture considers blood transfusions to be perfectly okay. They save lives, and it's hard to understand sometimes how another group could think that they're bad. Like they would be sinning or in some way doing something wrong by receiving blood transfusions, even when it's their kid. And their kid's going to die if they don't get the transfusion. Sometimes, other members of an outside group will be like, whoa, that just seems backwards. That doesn't seem to make any sense. So those people must be wrong. Whoops, you can't do that if you're a relativist. You see, it was fine to say that seems different, that seems backwards to what, the relativist's own group thinks, but you can't make that next move and say, oh yeah, and they're wrong for thinking that way. No, they could be perfectly right as long as that's the way their group, the group determines the morality. They answer to their group, not to our group. And then the examples can get even rougher. Like, what about things like enslavement? It doesn't have to just be, what we would in this country would be most familiar with, like racial-based enslavement, but it could be sex-based enslavement, enslaving males by females or males enslaving females. Any group that could have been enslaved by others based off of some trait, whether the rich are enslaving the poor, or some people of different skin tones enslaving people of different skin tones. Enslavement of any form. It could be ideological, where there's one group that buys into a particular political ideology could have been historically enslaved by some other group that has a different political ideology. Well, the idea, though, is enslavement as a practice, is it inherently good or inherently bad according to a moral relativist? No. It's not. Nothing is inherently good or bad for the moral relativist. Remember, the good or bad are relative to the group that one happens to be in. So if a group considers enslavement of others to be good, morally okay, then all the moral relativists can say is, well, yeah, if that's what they buy into, then in fact it is good for them. It may be bad were we to do it in our group, but if that group thinks because in our group it's deemed as bad, but in their group it's deemed as good, so it's good for them. So you could get the Nazis didn't do anything wrong as long as the majority of Nazis didn't think they were doing anything wrong. As long as the collective thought it was doing right, then the moral relativist is committed to be consistent in saying, well, according to their own lights and standards, they didn't do anything wrong. But now from the perspective of those that were receiving the terrible end of Nazi actions from their group, the Nazis could be doing something absolutely horribly wrong. And by our lights today, we could say, yeah, if the Nazis were to try that here today, absolutely bad. But if a person is trying to be a consistent moral relativist, they cannot go back in time and judge from our group today what happened back then, because historical groups we can never be members of. Notice once the group fades in time, that group can no longer be judged by us today because the group has ceased to be. So we can't enter the group. The only way we could judge the practices is become a member of that group and then work from the inside. And keep in mind, we're just entertaining these notions, trying to understand a position. I'm by no means saying that the relativists are right about any of this. That's not my job. My job is just to help everybody become familiar with the way a relativist, the sort of commitments the relativist has to take on. Another example that sometimes comes up is that with a moral relativist, suppose that we're the group in the United States, like we're U.S. citizens, that's the group, and then out there off of the coast in international waters, there's an island of everybody's pretty much child molester. They have children and they do, lewd, nasty stuff with them. Well, the idea is, can we judge their behavior? Being a consistent moral relativist, no, we cannot. The only group that can judge the behavior of whether it's right or wrong to do that practice is the group of child molesters. So if they think what they're doing there's nothing morally wrong with, there is, in fact, nothing morally wrong with it, according to a cultural or a moral relativistic position. Now, it could be absolutely terrible. We in our group could say, yeah, if you brought that here, You'd be bad, we'll condemn you. But if they're just staying in their own group, not reaching out, grabbing, children from our group, carrying them away, they're not, they're pretty much doing what they're doing out there in the middle of the ocean, international waters where no country has authority over it. That's their morality is determined by them. We cannot judge. We can't invade. We can't try to enforce our morality on them. It's like live and let live. If that's what they think's good, well, it's good for them. If we think it's bad, well, it would be bad for us, but not necessarily bad for them. That's the way relativism works. And what that means, moral relativism, that's just a commitment. I'm not saying this is an ultimate defeater of it. All that a relativist has to do to be consistent is say, yeah, that's the way it works. And if they want to defend it, provide some evidence that, yeah, that's exactly the way to think about it. But then genuine, like cross-cultural, moral, ethical evaluations, judgments, that's what I've been talking about, is that it's not possible. That I can't, if I was being a consistent moral relativist, I can't condemn the child molesters. The only way I could, the island of child molesters, the only thing I can do is say that would be bad were it to happen here, but it's not necessarily bad happening over there in that group. As long as that group doesn't think it's bad, it's not bad for them. It's not immoral for them or unethical, but it would be if it were here. That's the most you can do. But you see, that's not doing cross-cultural. I'm not judging them from afar. And that the difficulty, too, with relativism, and people may have already thought of this while they've been listening to what I've been saying, is that we're members of a lot of groups on any given day. And which group is the authority? Like, is it my family? Is it my U.S. culture? Is it or my French culture? If I was in France and a French citizen, what group does one ultimately answer to as the relativist? Which group reigns supreme over other groups? Because we all tend to have families. We all tend to work with peers. We have work in peer groups. We have school peer groups. We have a lot of things. Well, is it just the morality fluctuates depending on what group I happen to be in at any given time? So the morality's fluctuating like that? Maybe that is what's happening. But relativists needs to work that out. They need to explain that because it's not quite clear which group's ruling over others. Because, say, an example would be, say, that I'm in U.S. culture. That's a group. And the U.S. culture says, it's bad to kick puppies. But then my family group says, nah, it's not too bad. Well, who's the authority? Who judges me? Is it my family? Or is it U.S. culture? Is it a case where I go kick a puppy, the U.S. culture, says that's bad, maybe I get arrested for animal abuse, but then my family, they're like, oh, well, that doesn't really matter. We don't hold that against you. Is that how it plays out? If that's the case, it seems like a moral relativist may in fact answer to a whole lot of groups, just depending on which one they happen to be standing in at any given point in time. That might get a little confusing, but that may be an asset. That may be more dynamic and adaptive to the world in which we actually live. A relative is just, if one wants to defend this position, they need to kind of make sense of that. Offer some reasoning or example of how that works, in a way that might be persuasive to others who wouldn't initially think it would work. And then the relativists, they're often the target of the objectivist and absolutist criticism. Objectivists and absolutists tend not to like relativists because relativists are saying that the moral truth, these things that people would say is morally true, like it's bad to kick puppies, that could vary from culture to culture, group to group. And an objectivist, remember, they're looking for something out and beyond all groups. So a relativist is kind of antithetical to what the objectivist is doing, meaning that they're fishing in different waters, positionally. That the relativist is like, yeah, moral truths could be relative. That the island of child molesters, it could be morally true that what they're doing is not bad for them. And we over here, it could be morally true that it's horrible for us to do it. But we don't have any way to go over there and say they did something bad. And that may be not acceptable to an objectivist that wants to say, yeah, but we all answer to humanity. And that action's bad to just being a human member of the human species. But the relativists may not want to buy that. And so the objectivist tends to want to beat on the ideas of the relativists, argumentatively beat on them, try to generate criticism. That's why you end up with all these examples. It's easy for me to generate them as examples because every one of them has already been generated by people who hold these positions. And, I'm just collecting all this together to present it to you folks. So they tend to be a frequent target of objectivist absolutist criticism. But that doesn't mean that the criticism is right or accurate against them. It just means that they kind of put a bullseye on their back as far as these folks go. These folks just are going to, try to object and say that can't be right. And, the relativist has to be has to be good at defending their claims. The moral objectivist, the upside is no one's ever morally alone. That the thing is you're human whether you're here or you're a million miles from here. You're still human. And if humanity's what you answer to or morality, you still are answering to humanity even if people are a million miles away. As long as other people exist, you still have someone to answer to. So that, and that can be good, that we don't have to worry about if we lose our group, like with a relativist, if a person's booted out or ostracized from their group, well, then they lose all the moral guidance of that group. I mean, they have to find a new group, which may be very difficult, especially if the original group was, tended to have values and practices that were far, far and away from the other groups that are available that they could possibly join. They could truly be morally alone. A relativist could be if the group they're a member of ceases to be. Whereas a moral objectivist, though, they're never alone. Because everybody, regardless of group, is you're a part of life, you're a part of the biosphere, you're a part of humanity. Everyone could be a part of rationality, this collective human ability to reason and think systematically, or consistency. Like you could still be held accountable to being consistent and not making double standards. That you should, like in a case, moral objectivism, a good little thing is that notion of reciprocity built into things like principles like the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, or whatever variation of it you're most familiar with. That tends to be moral objectivism, where you do unto others as they would do unto you, regardless if there's others to do unto. It's kind of like a thing that's always lying in wait. That principle doesn't vanish just because other people are not around you at any given moment. It's still supposedly true for you, regardless. And that principle doesn't have to necessarily be tied to a particular religion. It can be just thought of as a reciprocity thing. Is I do something to someone else so that they hopefully do the same back in return to me. And that could just be a good moral tenet, to get along with other people. There could be, or it may not be. It just depends, which principles, a person wants to elevate. But the idea is that sort of golden rule would still hold, even if you were on an island with no other people. That's how moral objectivism works, is it's these things that are beyond our individual groups. And that genuine cross-cultural moral evaluations and judgments are possible. Why? Well, because the moral objectivists, they have things that scope over individual groups, the whims, desires, value systems of other groups. That the moral objectivists could say, yeah, that the island of child molesters is a crime against humanity. That's why they're wrong. Is that it's something wrong against all humans, regardless what island you're on or what group you're in. They can launch arguments like that. Now, I'm not saying their arguments would be right or, accurate or inaccurate. I'm just saying that's how the position works. It enables one to launch reasons like why is it wrong? The practice of the island of child molesters is wrong because it's a crime against humanity. And then they'll never defend, though, why humanity's something that has ultimate authority over us. They're just assuming it does. And so you see, that's how that moral objectivist position rides underneath reasoning. Normally, these positions are not made explicit by the person that is assuming them. That's why we're learning about them, so we can see under the lines of what they say. Because our purpose is to be able to understand, charitably make sense of what someone's actually saying when they're talking about ethics. And these things are under what they're saying most times. And they're not going to explicitly shot call it and tell you they're there. You just have to be familiar with them and know they're there. And genuine cross-cultural moral ethical agreements are possible with moral objectivism. Like we could have a group of, people who are kind to puppies, an island of, the puppy petters. And then we could be over here in our group, not on that island, and we think that petting puppies is morally good too. It makes the puppy happy. It doesn't hurt them. Our kids and all benefit. Everybody benefits. And so we could agree. We could actually genuinely share a value across both of those, like this value of kindness and being humane to animals. You see, that's the notion. We have the humane society. That's talking about, the idea is this sort of shared human behavioral values. Like being humane versus inhumane typically involves being good in light of being a member of the human species. Having the ability to hurt another species but not doing so. Reining in one's initial knee-jerk reaction to kick the bad cat versus realizing, oh, it's a cat. It didn't try to do this to be mean. Maybe it did. But at the same time, even if it did, the human could hold themselves to a higher standard of like, we're a much bigger creature. The cat's a much smaller creature. Kicking it could break bones, whereas they may not be the same, if I were to like kick a rhinoceros. But it's like that as a human, I have the ability to truly harm another species or a member of my own species, then I need not do that. That's the notion of humane that's in play, and that scopes over all groups. So we could actually, or a moral objectivist could actually look at another culture and say, yeah, they share our humane values. And so we agree with them. There's no miscommunication. We actually understand, and they're like us in that way. They may be different in other ways, but we agree with those practices, and we give moral praise to them, and that could be fine. And they could likewise, in turn, return the favor. So that's possible. Whereas a moral relativist, it could happen where, we agree, but maybe not. And there's also some wiggle room with objectivism. But rule modifications are possible. Like I said, if we modify the human species, that the rules of the game could change. Things that once hurt us don't no longer hurt us. Well, it may not be wrong to do something to someone that doesn't hurt them. When previously it would have been wrong because it hurt them. But if it no longer hurts them, then it may no longer be wrong. So you see, there's rule modifications in time. There's wiggle room. It can adapt. It can evolve. Many people tend to think they reside here. Many people actually are mishmash, but a lot of people tend to think they're moral objectivists, and they want to defend this position, which is totally fine. But the thing about it with moral objectivism is it lacks the absolute clarity, certainty, and stability of moral absolutism. That with moral objectivism, given that it can evolve, it can grow, that we can't ever be 100% certain that we've got the best notion of humanity today that's judging us and that we answer to. That notion could change. So moral objectivist always has to be on the lookout for any large changes to life, humanity, rationality. The very fact that it has wiggle room means that we can make mistakes. If you're a moral objectivist, a person has to be willing to accept that mistakes could be made. We don't have absolute certainty about it. I mean, we can have really, really good probabilistic certainty and evidence and support, but absolute certainty, that's not an inherent feature of moral objectivism. And then a person has to be very careful not to conflate personal, group desires and whims with those of nature's humanity. It's like one has to truly understand what they answer to. And remember, to truly understand it means you don't want to have made any mistakes in understanding it. And that can always happen. And so that's where it's like, one has to truly make every effort in the world as a moral objectivist to understand what they mean when they say that was a crime against humanity. Well, they need to know what they mean by humanity. What is that shared values? What is the values that you think scope over all of humans, regardless of what the individuals happen to believe or groups happen to believe? It's like, what are these universal across all human principles? And that's where, we encounter, we're going to encounter a lot of, more discussion about that with various ethical theorists that look for these universal style rules and conditions and stuff. The reason they do that is because that's part of being an objectivist, is you've got to kind of try to find these things that scope over all people. Now, remember, it's not beyond necessarily, an alien thing. But you do need something, you do need a lot of thought into that. Like, what does it really mean to be humane? What does it really mean to be inhumane? And really think about that and have a story to tell about that. That's kind of the obligation of the moral objectivist. I'm not saying that's an unattainable thing. It's not. People do this. They do a good job with it. But the idea is it is an obligation to be clear about exactly what is it that the objectivist thinks all humans answer to, and moreover, what does that actually mean? What values are in place? What are the disvalues that all people should share? I mean, we worked with some of this actually in that week one discussion. Like, what is the most fundamental values one thinks a society that's just starting out would need to promote? What are the most fundamental or ultimate disvalues? That was that exercise. Was trying to get people familiar with this way of thinking, because it's absolutely important to be able to think that way to understand a moral objectivist. Like, what is it that you think everybody would be willing to share? Or even if they disagree, they'd be wrong. It has to scope over all people. It's got to be statements and principles and values that every human, an objectivist thinks should hold or abide by. Because that's what we answer to, is those universal things. Universal over all humans or life or whatever, at least. Moral absolutist, there's no freedom to modify the rules, but there's no responsibility for their truth either, or their veracity. It's like, if the divine being says it's so, then it's so. All I have to do is have faith and accept it. I don't just have to have faith, though. I have to accept it. I mean, I have to believe it's true, too. And regardless of any counter evidence. But if you do that, the upside of moral absolutism is you get like absolute moral clarity. It's like you can have clarity, certainty, stability if you actually have the requirement of you have some special access to the divine mind. It's not only that a person thinks that a divine being said this is the right way to be. That's not enough. It has to be that they know that the divine being actually meant it to be that way. They know the divine's interpretation of it. They have special access. Like, essentially, they know the mind of God. Why? Because God's given them access to its mind. That's what this requires. But if that's possible, then you can have absolute certainty and clarity. There have been historical philosophy people that built arguments about this a lot. Like someone like Nicholas Malebranche made an argument. He talked about vision in God, where supposedly the idea was that the thoughts a person has when it comes to morality, that if they do, they reason, they think about them, they can actually figure out if those are in line with what's in the divine mind. And he has a whole method procedure. Is that plausible or not? I don't know. That's not our purpose at this stage to figure that out. But that's the sort of thing that comes along with moral absolutism. A person is only a legitimate absolutist when they not only believe, but they have some special knowledge that justifies that belief. And that may be more or less. That's why you'll get a lot of things about testimonials. You'll get, revelations, things like that. That's sort of where it comes from. That actual disagreement or acceptance of non-believers, that may not be possible with the moral absolutist. That if someone doesn't buy in to whatever the absolutist, like if they don't buy in that the divine collective is the one that everyone answers to, well, then that non-believer is just going to be wrong. There's no way that a moral absolutist can say, oh yeah, they think differently than I do. They may be right. Sort of like, they can't be a relativist. They can't be like, well, other people think differently than we do. So, maybe they're right. Maybe we could be mistaken. No, it can't be wish-wash. Like, it's got to be, we're right. Why? Because we have special access to the divine mind. We know these things. Over there, those folks that don't seem to have this access, well, they're just wrong. We can't accept what they're doing. They're wrong. I mean, the absolutist is able to judge harshly and severely and quickly, or praise just as elevatedly. It's not all bad. It's not all about judgment. It can be praise, There can be praise and there can be shame and blame, There can be all the stuff that's associated with morality and ethics. But it may not be possible to accept that someone claims, it's okay to kill, and your divine being says, no, it's not. Well, then the person who thinks it can be okay to kill, you're never going to be able to accept their belief. Never. So it's not going to happen. And so, one of the downside potential cons is that you could get fanaticism, where, a moral absolutist, could be totally fanatical about it. They go all the way out to acting this way in public, and it becomes relentless and overbearing. It could be, but it could also be other things, like they enter, a nunnery, or they go onto a mountain by themselves. So you see, fanatic doesn't have to necessarily mean, hurting other folks. It could just mean hermitage. But that's where it goes to an extreme, where it's like, this person has special access, and so unless someone else has the same special access and they both agree, this doesn't even have to have a group. It typically does have a group, though, but it doesn't have to. And then the moral mishmash, everyone can read this. The main thing with the moral mishmash that you have to be careful of if you defend it is that sometimes it's internally consistent, contradictory, and incoherent. Like an example, I've already mentioned this, but thou shalt not kill for abortions while simultaneously supporting capital punishment for serial killers. How do you deal with that? Where it's wrong to kill, absolutely, when it comes to abortions, but it's okay to kill when it comes to serial killers. What's doing the distinction there? Well, we already know it's that person may be a relativist about serial killer killing and an absolutist about fetus killing and abortions. But it's like, how do you work with that? How do you find common ground if you're trying to work a problem out? That's the sort of rough part of mishmash. Holding P and not P at the same time. It is a cat, but it's not a cat. It's killing, it's morally bad killing, but then it's not morally bad killing at the same time. But it's typically two different situations, like serial killers and abortions. But still, in terms of reason, logic, just philosophy in general, that's rough. But it tends to be likely where most people actually are. And in that way, it's maximally realistic. That a moral mishmash person is being within the norm. Totally within the norm of humanity. That just tends to be the way. That's the way the research points anyway. There's many more of these than there is the others. That being said, that's just some of the pros, the cons. I mean, but there's, I didn't mention the pros, but the pros is genuine agreements and disagreements with others are possible. It's likely where most people actually are. I mean, it's got, it does have the greatest degree of moral uncertainty because who knows what position we may or may not be taking at any given argument or situation. So we have to take everything case by case and every word case by case. The situation where one person can be talking about death as being bad, and another person, a moral mishmash person, can be talking about death as bad, and they could still not mean the same thing by death. And they may not mean the same thing by bad. So this requires looking at every word in common to make sense of it. Because, I mean, that's just the level of scrutiny it takes to analyze arguments that are launched by this kind of people who hold this kind of position. Okay, we've looked at the positions, we've looked at the pros and cons of each of these positions. Now let's move to say a few words about this week's discussion.